Cathy Glasson, opinion editor of the Des Moines Register, and we're here with Fred Hubbell, who is meeting with Des Moines Register reporters and editors. Fred, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. Much appreciate it.
Fred's a Democratic candidate for governor, and let's go around the room briefly, starting with Carol.
Carol Hunter, executive editor.
Reka Basu, opinion columnist.
Rachel Stassenberger, political editor.
Brianne Fonensteel, political reporter.
David Shivers, president.
Okay, and also in the room with us are two of Fred's staffers, Kevin McCarthy and Remy Yamamoto. So thanks again for being here. Why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and especially what qualifies you to be governor of Iowa?
Well, first of all, thank you for making this opportunity available. I very much appreciate that. You know, I'm originally from Iowa, a fifth-generation Iowan, a lifelong progressive Democrat. And, you know, I've worked in the private sector. Used to run the Yonkers department store business during the farm crisis of the 80s. And we took a business that was basically break-even and made it much more successful, so we sold ultimately to the public a few years later. But I've had no relationship to Yonkers since 1992, you know, in connection with the current problems that they have. And then I led Equitable Life Insurance Company of Iowa with insurance agencies in Iowa as well as across the rest of the country. Grew that business substantially. And then later on, I went to work twice for state government. Governor Culver asked me to go to work to chair the Iowa Power Fund Board for 4 years, helping to make the state continue to be a leader in renewable energy, renewable fuels, energy efficiency. And in the midst of that, he asked me to take over the leadership of the Department of Economic Development because we had a film tax credit scandal. It was costing Iowans tens of millions of dollars. So I went in there and worked with the Attorney General's office. We solved that crisis and saved the state a lot of money, but also reoriented what the department was doing in terms of their approach to economic development. And in the meantime, you know, my wife and I have spent the better part of the last 30 years really working in our community, the community being the state, trying to support the progressive values and quality of life that we enjoyed in Iowa, and I think most Iowans enjoyed, because that's what makes Iowa a special place and always has. I used to be on a Planned Parenthood board in the 1980s. I chaired the board for a year. And then later, I served on as a board member of Simpson College. I chaired that board for 6 years. I chaired the Iowa College Foundation Board, working to help expand access to higher education for young people in our state. My wife and I have both helped Broadlands Hospital expand their mental health services and add 2 new psychiatrists over the last several years. We've also worked, each of us separately and together, in the environmental area for many different groups, trying to improve our air and water quality in Iowa. And we've been doing that for well over a decade. Unfortunately, we have not made much progress. Some, but not nearly enough. So, you know, I think that the other part I would mention that, you know, I did meet my wife in law school in the property class. You can ask whether one of us acquired the other, but it happened in property classes when we first met. And we've been, you know, happily married for 41 years with 3 children and 3 grandchildren, and we're good partners, and we work well together on a lot of issues and a lot of things that are important to us, but also to our fellow Iowans.
What do you think sets you apart from the other Democrats in the race in particular?
Well, I think the biggest difference is you know, and I mentioned the private sector work I've done and the 2 jobs I did in state government. I know how to get results. You know, I've proven that I can lead organizations, whether it's a state department or it's a state board with a lot of diverse interests on there. There are a lot of Republicans on their board, elected Republican officials and Democrats. In the private sector, we had a farm crisis, and we built the business, improved it. I've proven I know how to get results by investing in people. And that's ultimately what we should be doing in our state, is investing in people. We're not doing enough. So I want to take those skills that I've demonstrated I have in leadership and getting results to state government. We're not getting results. All the tough questions, whether it's water quality or health care or education or actually our budget, are not being dealt with. They're just being talked about on the surface and no real results for Iowans. So I think I've got the leadership skills and the experience, and I've demonstrated that, but I also have 30 years of working for progressive values and quality of life in our state.
There have been a lot of policies passed or legislation passed to address the issues, but you say we're not getting results. how would you structure your policies or your solutions to make sure that you know whether you're getting results or not?
Well, in my experience in state government as well as in the private sector, if you don't put funding behind your initiatives and your priorities, they're not really priorities. And that's what's happening in our state. I mean, you know, your newspaper and a lot of other people have said, and I agree, that the mental health bill that was passed recently has some good ideas, but it has no funding. So nothing is going to happen. And we're not going to see any results. You know, so to me, obviously that's not a real priority of this legislature and this governor, or they would find the money to fund actual progress, whether it's for the access centers or the community-based services. It's the same in education. You know, they talk about some ideas in education that have some appeal, but there's no funding for it. Or they're actually taking money from the community colleges and putting it into state government instead. These things aren't going to improve in our state unless we are willing to step up, make the hard decisions to stop the wasteful corporate giveaways, which I helped to identify in 2010, $160 million worth, and instead put that money to the long-term benefit of our state in education and healthcare and job training and infrastructure.
Well, let's talk about the money then. The Republicans passed a sweeping income tax bill at the end of the legislative session. What would you change about the tax code? Assuming you come in as governor, this is the law of the land, this tax scheme. What would be your priorities for changing that?
Well, first of all, I would have never passed this tax cut. I mean, I think it's badly timed, and it's a bad idea. You know, look, we have a fiscal crisis in our state. This governor's borrowed $144 million from the reserve funds and has no plan to pay it back yet. She was supposed to pay it back in 2018, during the fiscal year 18. She didn't do it. You know, she's underfunded education and healthcare and infrastructure for the 2 years she's been in charge. She's also had 2 years in a row of mid-year sizable budget cuts. So, you know, I don't think we know what's going on in our budget today. They haven't agreed on what the MCOs are going to be paid for this next year. And they were supposed to agree in January. I think they're afraid of what that number is going to be. They didn't want to know that number, so they didn't negotiate it, because that would have made it tough to do the tax cut. You know, it's a lack of transparency. It's a lack of openness from this government in terms of what's really going on fiscally. What I would have done is to recognize, look, there's tariffs out there that have already cost livestock producers $400 million in lost commodity values. We have risk of additional tariffs. We have risk of changes to renewable fuel standard, much less potential changes to NAFTA. Now is not the time when we can't balance our budget, we can't pay back the debt we have, and we have those storm clouds. Now is not the time to do a tax cut.
So you're governor in January of 2019. What do? Repeal that tax cut, or are you doing other things to make it more revenue neutral? What do you do?
Well, you have to take a look at what the environment looks like at that time. I mean, it's a very hypothetical question. Are the tariffs going to get better? Are the tariffs going to get worse? I don't know that. We don't know that. But what I'm going to do, you know, if I happen to get elected as governor, starting on the day after the election, I'm going to start working with the Republican leadership and the Democratic leadership to figure out how we're going to balance our budget. And do we have a challenge or do we not have a challenge? What's going on around our state? What's happening in our state? And let's make sure we have a balanced budget and we don't have to make mid-session big adjustments again.
But if you decide that the budget's not sustainable, or that you can't balance the budget based on the revenue left by the tax cut, do you raise taxes again? Do you look for other sources of revenue?
I would do the same thing that I did when I was running the State Department of Economic Development, or what I did in our businesses. You figure out what your priorities are, which is, first of all, to balance the budget, and second of all, to fund the priorities around education and healthcare in the state so we can get growing again. And to do that, I'm going to go after the wasteful corporate giveaways first, because that's money that the state should not be spending. And that's, by the way, I don't consider that a tax cut. I consider that being fiscally responsible and doing the right thing with the taxpayer money. And then secondly, I would look at, for instance, the commercial property tax cut that was just made a couple of years ago, that the state now is saying they're not going to backfill. Well, the reason they're not backfilling is it's not creating value for our state. If it was creating value, they wouldn't have a problem doing the backfill. So, you know, we should take a look at that and you know, claw that 10% back, particularly for the larger out-of-state businesses. Maybe for small in-state businesses, you keep that. There's been many other tax cuts that they've put through. They just put through a $30 million tax cut for the telecommunications companies in our state. They didn't ask for it. They didn't offer anything in return. Why are we doing that? You know, there's a lot of examples of where this governor and this legislature have systematically reduced state revenue after it comes into the state, and then they give it back without getting anything in return or not enough in return. That's where I want to put my first attention.
What's your position on the sales tax? They called it a sales tax modernization that was passed as part of this. It is additional revenue, but it adds sales tax to especially digital services and products. There was a kind of a split in the Democratic Party about that. Some saw it as money that the state would be collecting anyway. Others said, no, it's regressive. You know, where do you come down on that?
Well, first of all, let's recognize that they have that in their new tax plan. But what happens if the Supreme Court doesn't change the law of the land? Then all of a sudden that tax cut we just passed as a state is going to be losing a lot of revenue because that's planned. That revenue is planned in their tax plan, and there's no promise, there's no guarantee the Supreme Court is going to change the law, because right now you cannot tax internet sales. You can have a use tax. Colorado is doing that, but it collects very little money and it's very complicated. So until the Supreme Court changes the law that will allow states to tax internet sales, you can't do it. So assuming that they do it, so it can be done, then I think there's an issue about the relative fairness and equality between internet businesses that don't pay income sales tax and local businesses that do. I think it made sense to have a tax advantage for the internet industry to develop and get started, but obviously it's a fully fledged, viable industry today on its own, a marketplace, and so it doesn't need to have that tax advantage today. So I think it makes sense if the Supreme Court changes the law for states like Iowa to go ahead and take advantage of that and start taxing internet sales just like we tax sales by in-state businesses.
For those of us who don't know, remind us of your position on the 3/8 penny for environment and outdoor recreation.
Well, that's one of the biggest opportunities we have in our state. You know, I mentioned earlier that for 30 years we've had a water quality problem in our state, and it's just getting worse. We need to step up and address that, because if we do it in the right way, where we pull people together, Iowans all across the state, it's not an urban-rural issue, it's not us, them, we're all part of the problem. We need to be all part of the solution. If we approach that in that mindset, we can improve our water quality at the same time that we improve our topsoil. The nutrient reduction strategy has several different ideas. I think there's 10 or 12 of them that actually would, if we implement those, would improve topsoil and water quality at the same time. But it needs permanent long-term funding. It's a $4.5 billion issue in our state, and it's getting bigger. So the single best way to address that is to fund the Natural Outdoor Resources Trust Fund with the 3/8% sales tax. The reason it's the best way is because we need permanent funding. That's the only source of potential permanent funding to address preservation of topsoil, improvement of water quality, and it also improves the quality of life in terms of hunting and fishing and boating and recreation, which also leads to more revenue from tourism, which has been on the decline, and it used to be a good industry for us. And it also has money in there for flood mitigation. We've had over $10 billion of flood damage since 1993 in our state. $10 billion. Only 10% of the money in that 3/8 annually, which is about $15 million, goes to flood mitigation. But why wouldn't we invest $15 million in order to save $10 billion down the road? Because we're going to have more floods. So let's start investing in flood mitigation. So that 3/8 really helps rural Iowa, urban Iowa, farmers, city people, tourism, recreation, agriculture interests, and it will help attract more businesses and more people that want to live and work in our state.
There has been some interest group polling that suggests Iowans would be willing to raise the sales tax a full penny and include the 3/8 for the water quality priorities you just mentioned, but also pay for some other priorities such as healthcare, mental health. Is that something that you would be in favor of, and would you propose that?
No, I'm in favor of the 3/8%, because that's what's constitutionally protected. Any more than 3/8%, I believe the way it was passed in the legislature and signed by the governor, does not go into that fund, which means that if we raise, just take an example, 5/8, that other 2/8% is not guaranteed to go to water quality or to anything else. Governor Branstad brought the lottery system into Iowa many years ago and promised it would forever go towards supporting education. That lasted for 4 or 5 years until he needed the money in the general fund, and he took it out, and it's never gone back into education. So that's the risk of raising the sales tax to take mental health. We need funding for mental health. Absolutely we do. But it's going to take a consistent, viable approach to funding that. And if we raise the sales tax 5/8 of a cent, there's no guarantee that's going to go towards mental health. So what I want to do is manage the budget with the resources we have properly first, stop making bad decisions with the taxpayers' money, and put that where we need to, which is in education and healthcare. And we should also look, rather than raise that sales tax, which is regressive, as you know, we should be looking at, for instance, on the mental health side, talking to counties about whether it makes sense for the counties to be able to raise their own mental health levy. The state has now prohibited them from doing that. Well, maybe the counties need to have the option of raising that themselves. Maybe that's a better way than having a regressive sales tax.
You mentioned the lottery for a second. Would you want the lottery money to go back 100% to paying for education? Is that something that you would consider doing?
Well, my point is, unless it's constitutionally protected to do that, any governor can change their mind, or any legislature can.
Right. So how would you change your mind? Would you say Terry Branstad didn't keep that promise, so you put lottery money back into education?
Well, the first thing I want to do, I think I've tried to be clear, is stop the wasteful corporate giveaways. That's about $160 million a year. It was identified in 2010. I think it's actually bigger now because there's no caps and no sunsets in place, which are part of the recommendations that we made in 2010. I want to use that money to fully fund pre-K and K-12. Let's say that's $30 million is 1%. So 2% more just to get up to the level of inflation would be $60 million more for K-12 to fully fund it at that level. We probably need another 15 to 20 million to fully fund pre-K on an all-day basis. So let's say that's 75 or 80 million. You still have that much amount of money left. I'm happy to put that towards mental health, substance abuse, making sure that we do a good job when we bring back the privatization of Medicaid, so we don't have all these hiccups and all these patients are having their benefits reduced and the providers being run out of business. And we can also use some of that to invest in infrastructure across the state. We should do that first because that money is already here. I don't want to do any gimmicks in state government, state budget until, that we want to take care of good fiscal management first. Then we start looking at what else we can do to try to make sure government is run effectively.
You mentioned a few times corporate giveaways. You are on record talking about the research and activities tax credit.
Yes, ma'am.
And suggesting perhaps that should become a deduction. Could you be more specific about other specific tax credits that you would eliminate or change?
Well, that's the biggest one, research activities tax credit. When I was in economic development, we were writing checks, we the state were writing checks for $25 million a year. Now it's over 40 because there's no cap. So it just keeps getting bigger, and it's projected to get into the 50s if we don't do anything. Well, that just eats away at our budget every year. So what I have suggested there, and I said it back, and I suggested it back in 2010, was that we should take for the large corporations that are getting a refundable portion of that tax credit, we should eliminate for the large corporations the refundability and give them a deduction. And I'm happy to extend the carry forward period so they can have more years to take advantage of that deduction. But the point is, if they have to pay income taxes to take advantage of the deduction. So they can do that, and they get the full advantage of it, but the state saves the checks. We'd be saving $40 million a year.
Okay, that leaves about 120 million more. What other specific tax credits?
Well, if you go back and look at that study, I think there's maybe 10 or 12 tax cuts, tax credits, where we determined that the benefit to the taxpayer was less than the cost of the benefit and the deduction. In some cases, we recommended that they be reduced. Other cases, we said they should be eliminated. And it's not just corporate; it's also on the individual side. So what we should do is go back to that study and freshen it up and just update that fiscal impact analysis. We still need caps, and we still need sunsets on all of those. It should be on every credit and deduction all across our state government. It's just good fiscal management. But we should refresh that study and look at those to see whether the impact analysis we did then shows the same kind of result that it would today.
Assuming that you can not spend that $160 million in what you call corporate giveaways, you've talked about using that money both for education and healthcare and mental health. Do you think 160 million will actually last long enough to fund all those priorities?
No, I don't.
So then how will you actually fund them?
Well, I think what we need to recognize in our state is we need to have a short-term strategy of fixing our fiscal mismanagement and the wasteful corporate giveaways that we're putting out every year and the lack of funding to education and healthcare. But the point is, state government and is going to be here for the long term. So we need to also be making investments in our state for the long term so we can grow our economy the right way. And to grow our economy the right way, which is how we used to do it, is by having some of the best educational system results in the country. We used to be one of the best. When I was running the businesses I was running, we could recruit people to move to Iowa because Iowa had the reputation for having the best educational system in the country. We can't do that today. Now we're rated a C or C minus by the educators that rate companies, states on that. So let's invest in that education, and let's invest in job training. We used to have a robust job training program in our state. Well, that's fallen by the wayside too. Some communities are very good at it, but there's a lot of places in our state that have no job training. So when young people get out of school, there's no opportunity for them to have learned a trade or a skill. And if they don't want to college, what are they going to do? So we need to step up and address more job training all across our state too. If we make those investments, and we invest in healthcare so we have a more productive workforce and we have a better quality of life because we have healthcare more available for people in our state, and we invest in high-speed internet and housing all across our state, then we can attract higher quality jobs that pay higher incomes. We've spent the last 7 or 8 years bringing a lot of $15 an hour jobs in our state. They've driven down our unemployment, but they've not helped Iowans have any kind of increase in their personal income. For the last 4 years, we've been either 47th, 8th, or 9th in personal income growth in this state. We need to focus on the long term, invest in education, invest in healthcare, invest in infrastructure, and recruit higher quality jobs that pay higher incomes. Part of that is continuing to build out our wind. We can still add more capacity for wind jobs in our state. We have 7,000 now. When I was at economic development, we had 1,500. Well, we could probably have 10,000. Sun is the same. We have the 14th best sun in the country for purposes of generating solar capacity. When I'm traveling around the state, I see solar arrays everywhere on a lot of farms, farmhouses, farm fields. I mean, people buy that. They understand that. So let's invest in solar. We could probably have 3,000 or 4,000 jobs in solar. Today we have about 1,000. That also drives down the cost of energy. It makes it easier to recruit businesses. It makes our businesses more successful. Let's invest more in biomass. We have one of the biggest sources of biomass in the country. When I was at the Power Fund, we supported the growth of the cellulosic ethanol plant in Harrisburg, Iowa. That is new generation technology that's not using corn, that's using the stover to generate electricity, and energy. So let's continue to invest in those kind of projects. Take advantage of the natural assets that we have right here and invest in those to recruit jobs and build our businesses.
So in terms of investing all those things, education, job training, healthcare, high-speed internet, biomass, sun, wind, etc., how much more is that going to cost the state, and how will you raise that money?
Well, the long term is we have to be willing to make the investments in the education and the healthcare and the infrastructure in order to attract those higher quality jobs. And we're going to continue to have some small state credits for wind and for solar, just like we do. And we shouldn't be reducing those. We should be continuing that activity. If we expand those jobs like I was talking about, that's going to bring more revenue into our state. If we attract higher quality jobs, they're paying $30 an hour rather than $15 an hour, that brings more revenue into our state. If we put in place a prevailing wage requirement, which I did when I was at the Department of Economic Development, that says we're not going to put any state money in a project where we bring in contractors that don't pay at least the prevailing wage. That's going to bring more money into our state because we don't have that now. So we're bringing in contractors that are paying less than the prevailing wage. We're dumbing down the economic output in our state. There's a lot of steps like that that will help grow incomes and grow revenue. But those are those long-term commitments that we need to make.
You've been critical of the Branstad-Reynolds method for attracting businesses, especially using the incentives and subsidies. But the Register's reporting on the effect of the construction phase alone of the Iowa fertilizer plant did show significant impact on that southeast Iowa, that corner of the state. Can you really say that that wasn't worth it, considering that investment, local businesses, et cetera?
Construction jobs are great jobs. We all understand that. But in reality, and you know this as well as I do, a lot of those construction jobs, you look at the license plates on those trucks, they weren't Iowa license plates. They were coming from Missouri and Illinois. A high percentage of them were. Now they're all gone. All those construction jobs are gone. All those people that were going to the restaurants and using, the services that Iowa provides, before they went home at night or went home in the weekends, they're all gone now. So you talk to the folks down there now, there's not a lot of impact. We need to have long-term impact in our state. Let me give you an example. We have $120 million of tax credits in the data centers surrounding Des Moines now. $120 million in tax credits. We could have used those a lot differently. What if we had used those? Because we only have about 600 or 700 jobs, right? In data centers, there's no spin-off activity. There's no supply chain associated with those data centers. They're just warehouses or garages that have machines in them and some maintenance people. What if we had used those tax credits to go out to all the municipal utilities in our state and all the telecom companies in our state and said, look, we're going to give you a tax credit to expand high-speed internet to every nook and cranny of our state, so that everywhere in our state had good quality high-speed internet. We could attract a lot more jobs all across our state than that 600 or 700. And people could work where they live. They wouldn't have to live where they work, which means we could have more people living in rural Iowa rather than having to move to Des Moines or Cedar Rapids or Ames or Iowa City. There's nothing wrong with that, but people need to have the choice, the alternative. We could attract more people to move back to rural Iowa if we actually had good quality high-speed internet. When I was in Storm Lake, we met with a bunch of college students there at Buena Vista. And one of the women there has a new job at PayPal. It's a great job. So I asked her, look, do you have high-speed internet here in Storm Lake? Well, no, it's not very good. If you had high-speed internet, could you have done that job here rather than in San Francisco? And she said yes. But she can't do it now because she doesn't have high quality enough internet to be able to get that job and work in Storm Lake. Let's create those opportunities. I would much rather have high-speed internet all across our state than a bunch of data centers soaking up high-quality farmland and bringing very few jobs and using a lot of tax credits.
What else would you do to revitalize rural Iowa? I mean, it's great if more people can live there, but unless you have businesses moving into rural Iowa, unless you have manufacturing, et cetera, it's very hard to pay for the services that get people to move to those towns.
Well, right now, the biggest challenge is we have a lot of jobs available in rural Iowa, but trade jobs, skilled jobs. Every manufacturer out there needs people. Look at all the trades that build houses and do all the construction work need people. The schools need people because we have teachers that are moving to Minnesota now. They don't want to be in Iowa anymore. So what I want to do is partner with the local communities. Take as an example, let's say, Vilsack had a Vision Iowa program. What I would do is take that but make it a little bit different and make it more flexible to make it available for more things, such as housing, such as for community-based mental health treatment, such as take Fort Dodge. They have an issue where they need more teachers. Potential teachers go up there and they look around, they don't like the housing. So they need housing and they need teachers. So if they're willing, if they recognize that that's a big issue to help Fort Dodge move forward, and they're willing to put some local private money and public money into that, the state should be their partner and team up with them so that we recruit teachers to go to Fort Dodge. We've built some new housing for them, and over 5 years that the person commits to be in Fort Dodge teaching for 5 years, and if they do that, the local community and the state together pay off their student debt. And we could do that, take an example of a town that wants to, need some community-based mental health treatment facilities. That's going to take some upfront money. Well, if they've got local leadership and local people who are willing to work in there and do the work, and they have local community-based and private money that's willing to help fund that, the state should be their partner to put that in place. We need those facilities all across Iowa. Let's partner with local communities who have the local commitment and local leadership to do that. And let's put,
is that a state? I mean, is that a state cash program where you would appropriate money for
it's not a state cash
or
program.
would it be bonding?
It would be bonding, just like we did in Vilsack Iowa. By the way, the Vision Iowa, those bonds are going to be mostly paid off, I think, by the end of next year. So that money becomes available. Now, this governor took that money and has said we're going to use that for water quality. Well, What I'm going to do is balance the budget better so I can recapture that and bond against that to make investments in rural Iowa. So we know over the next 10 years we're going to have those investments going all across rural Iowa. And I wouldn't make it available for the big cities like Des Moines and Cedar Rapids. They don't need that kind of support. We need that in the smaller communities spread all across our state. And for economic development, rather than giving the Apples of the world $20 million in tax credits, why don't we invest in students? So if we want to recruit a doctor or a teacher to go to work in rural Iowa, even if it's not in cooperation with the local community, and they're willing to commit to go do that for 5 years, we need more physicians out there. We need more psychiatrists, more psychologists, and we also need more teachers and a lot of other skilled trades. So if they're willing to go out to rural Iowa to be a diesel mechanic in Harlan, Iowa, for example, or they're willing to be a psychiatrist and work out of Harlan, Iowa and serve that area, because John Rosenman's not going to be able to live forever. And he does a wonderful job, but he's going to need somebody to follow him. So then let's have a program that if a student commits to do that, we'll pay off, the state will pay off their debt in 5 years. We're investing in people to go to work in our state. It reduces the student debt, and it's a much better investment because we're investing in the future of our workforce rather than just giving tax credits to Apple, who's not bringing very many jobs here.
What would you say your overall vision for education is? Where would you want Iowa's education system to be after your first 4 years as governor?
Well, my visions always go longer than 4 years. But I think the goal has to be quality, lifelong learning available for every Iowan. And that's not available today. So we need to fully fund pre-K. I'd like to do it on an all-day basis. So that helps the daycare costs and availability for families who are struggling to be able to work 2 or 3 jobs and take care of daycare. So let's do it on an all-day basis and fully fund that. That's why I think it's another 15 to 20 million. Let's at least fund K-12 at the level of inflation, and let's aspire to be the best again. For some reason, this governor, this legislature, they're perfectly happy to have the quality decline consistently in our K-12 education system. It's not the teacher's fault, it's not the principal's fault, it's Iowans' fault. We're not willing to recognize that we need to be the best again. And we used to be the best, so it's not something we've never done, it's something we have done recently. And let's commit to get back there. Let's be willing to make those investments, because that's what's going to grow our economy. That's what's going to help people stay in our state, younger people. We talked about needing more people to live and work here. If we have better education, we're going to have better jobs. And let's be willing to make those investments. But we also need to make college affordable, so we're not keeping large increases in tuition going up. We need to require the community colleges, the private colleges, and the Regency institutions to work much more closely together, to collaborate and coordinate, rather than run them as separate categories. And they're willing to do that. I've been talking to a lot of those folks, and they want to work together. They know it's a new world in education, and they know they got to cooperate more. So let's facilitate that. Let's encourage it. And let's have that job training I mentioned in every high school all across our state. But it needs to be in partnership. Local businesses need to contribute to that, because they're going to be the beneficiaries. If we're training people to be a mechanic or a pipe fitter, or we're training them to be able to go to work in a manufacturing facility, the local business is going to hire those people. They're going to benefit. They should be contributing to the cost of that.
When you say require community colleges and the Regency universities to work more closely together rather than run them as separate categories, are you saying put the community college system under the Regents, or?
I'm not talking about an organizational restructure.
Okay.
I mean, I just think we need to allow them to do that. When I talk to the president of the University of Iowa, he wants to do that. They're already doing it quite well, nicely with Kirkwood. When I talk to and I know most of the presidents of the private colleges because I served in that board for 30 years, and the Iowa College Foundation Board, they know they need to change, and they're willing to cooperate.
Okay. Is there something structural that's stopping them from doing that now, or is it just you need to have the leadership?
They're not being encouraged. They're not being supported to do that. They're not being rewarded to do that. It takes, we need a leader in the governor's office and in the legislature who recognize that let's not demonize these people. They're working very hard. They're educating the people in our state very well, which we need, and we need to even do a better job. And they're also big economic engines in our state. The community colleges are, the private colleges are, and the regents. They need our support and encouragement. But they also need our support to recognize that the way you deliver education today is not the way when some of us were going to college. And let's support that, and let's make sure that University of Iowa can provide online learning to the private college or to a community college or vice versa. And let's make sure that that gets encouraged and supported.
I'm going to circle back to healthcare unless somebody wants to jump in with a question.
I do want to ask about one place where the state has invested significantly in K through 12 is in the teacher leader program for leadership in the classroom, preparation, mentorship for beginning teachers. Do you think that's been a wise investment or not?
Carol, I have to say, I don't know enough about that yet because I've heard a lot of opinions on both sides. Because in many cases, it takes our best teachers out of the classroom. And that's an issue I think we need to be aware of. But it also is important that we mentor and encourage and train beginning teachers. So we have to look at that. I'm not sure whether we want to expand it or change it yet, but I want to learn more about that because we clearly need to mentor and train on-job training the new teachers because they need that and they benefit from it. But we also need to make sure that our best teachers actually have time in front of students.
So you may have already answered this, but I just think it's on the education front. So you'd made the comment of demonizing some of these folks that are working very hard. What do you think?
Demonizing?
Yeah, you had mentioned that we should not demonize.
Yes.
Yeah, we should not demonize. That demonizing has been happening.
Right.
So my question is, what are the factors in your mind that have led to the decline in our educational rankings as a state? And you've mentioned vision and leadership. What do you think is going to take culturally for us to move forward and be the best again?
Well, it starts with saying we want to be the best. We have been the best. We know how to do it. And we've let that slip. Let's go back and be the best again because it's important to the future success of our state and the people who live in our state. And then, so that means all Iowans have to buy into that and know that that's the strategy and that's the direction. And that means we need to restore collective bargaining rights. If we want people to be willing and interested and excited to become teachers in our state, then they need to have collective bargaining rights. Because right now, they're finding out that all they can talk about with their school superintendents is wages. Well, in the meantime, benefits are being cut, and other things are being changed. And that's not right. We need to give teachers the support and respect that they deserve in order to do the professional job that we're going to expect of them. We also need to recognize that if we're going to keep having 1% on average for the last 6 or 7 years increase in school funding, we all know that's not going to be enough because that's clearly underfunding compared to at least the rate of inflation. And in your household or in any business that you're in, if you're going to underfund your payroll, well, that's what teachers are, their payroll. If we're going to underfund them and the schools and the supplies and the new technology that they need consistently, then ultimately it's not going to work. That you cannot keep cutting and cutting and cutting and expect to get a better result. I've never seen a business or a government that's successful at that. Look at Kansas and Oklahoma. They can't even keep their schools open 5 days a week now in their public schools. So I don't think that's where we want to go. So we need funding, we need aspirations, we need respect for our teachers, and we need to make sure that they're getting not only the teachers, but the school boards and the superintendents and the principals are getting the right kind of training and support. And we've got to get parents involved. They need to know that we want to be the best again, and it's going to be beneficial for them, and they need to give our teachers and the people that work in our schools the support and respect that they need in order to be successful.
Before we leave education, what's your philosophy on public money going to private schools, private education? Would you continue that as it is? Would you roll it back?
I want to, the first obligation I believe as state government is to fully fund top quality public schools. So I want to fund our K-12 schools on a fully funded basis, and I want to do the same with pre-K. All kids deserve an opportunity to get started the right way in our state. There's too many children that don't get started the right way at age 3 and particularly at age 4, and so they get into school and they're behind already and they never have a chance to catch up. So that's about social equity, it's about diversity, equity, and giving all kids the opportunity to be successful and in their families. And I think that's where we need to start. We need to start there, and then we need to fully fund K-12 education. That's got to be the most important thing in education that we do.
I'm not totally sure you answered my question though. If you say fully funding public school is the top priority, but does that mean there's no room for state money going into private schools, private parochial schools?
Well, there's a tax credit in our state. It's actually the highest percentage tax credit that we have. It's 65% tax credit. That helps provide a tax credit for people who are giving money and supporting private schools in our state. One of the recommendations, go back to one of Carol's questions earlier, one of the recommendations in that tax credit review panel was that that tax credit is too big. If you look at it, a very high percentage of that money, I think it's like $15 million a year, somewhere close to that, goes to very high income earners in our state. So we have high income earners are getting a tax credit to send their kids to a private school. And our panel, which had economists from around the state as well as department heads, recommended that that's not a good return for the state of Iowa, that instead we should reduce the amount of money and it should be means tested. And so if people want to move their kids into a religious school or a private school, they can do that. But if they're a high income earner, you know, they're not going to get full advantage of the tax credit. We're going to make that more available to people who can't afford it, and also cap the amount of money that goes there. So I think, you know, those kind of changes need to be looked at. It needs to be freshened up and make sure that the returns are still not adequate for our state. But I know plenty of people who do homeschooling and do a very good job, and we need to support that. But what we want to make sure is where we are allowing students to be educated outside of the public school arena, that we have supervision and oversight on what's happening with those kids. Because what has happened to some of those kids in the last year or two who have had very tragic results because they're not getting supervision and oversight by the Department of Human Services or by the state, whether it's through foster care or whether it's through homeschooling or any other situation. All kids need to have at least annual reviews of their educational progress and their health.
So speaking of health, let's start with Medicaid. How do you fix the problems that are being caused by privatized managed care? And if you are to go back to state-run managed care, how do you manage the money so that it is predictable and manageable year to year?
Well, it starts with recognizing that what we're doing now is a failure. We're not going to get any better unless we recognize that the privatization of Medicaid as it's being done in our state is a failure. It's a failure for patients, it's a failure for providers, and it's a failure for the taxpayers. And I've said that from the middle of the year last year, and it's not gotten any better. Matter of fact, they can't even decide what they're going to have to pay those people anymore because they aren't unwilling to negotiate the terms yet. The Ombudsman comes out with terrible reports about how the appeals process is managed and what the managed care organizations are doing afterwards. So let's recognize that it's a failure, and then as governor, I would start on day one to bring it back under state management. It used to cost the state 4 to 5% overhead costs. Now we're paying 12 to 15. You know, why are we doing that? You know, that math doesn't make sense. So we're going to have to recruit people to come back in to go to work at DHS. We're going to have to recruit new managers who have a much more enlightened view of how to run a state Medicaid system than the people we have now. And we need to take a focus on recognizing that we don't want to treat everybody who's in the Medicaid system the same, which is what this Medicaid MCOs are trying to do. You know, the people that have more serious disability issues or more serious health issues that are in Medicaid need to be treated on a much more customized basis. They need to be encouraged and supported to be able to stay in more home-based services rather than forced into institutions. I can't tell you how many examples I've seen of people who are providing home-based services at a much lower cost and a much better service than what it costs to be in an institutional setting. And so let's recognize that and let's try to support that. At the same time, there's a number of categories of people in the Medicaid arena that don't need that customized support and can be handled in a more systematic way that focuses on prevention and early detection and identification of high-risk kind of behaviors. And let's address those so that we can help them have better health and less health care costs. So, but the point is, we don't want to treat everybody the same anymore. We need to be able to have a system that recognizes, like many other states do, that there's a lot of choices between the old fee-for-service, which, okay, wasn't working as well as it needed to, and this just straight managed care operation, which doesn't work either.
Even if you can roll back the privatization of Medicaid, there's still going to be significant healthcare issues as the Affordable Care Act continues to erode, if
Right.
that continues to happen. So how do you address that on a state level? Do you try to make more people eligible for Medicaid? How do you keep people from falling through the cracks if they can't no longer, or they're not getting subsidies or can't afford this federal health care option?
You know, I appreciate that question, because there actually are several very good ideas that this governor has failed to show the willingness to be a leader and to adopt new approaches. As an example, and in the very first day of the session, Representative Forbes and Senator McCoy introduced a bill that would have allowed people who could not afford or didn't have access to private health insurance to voluntarily opt in on a means-tested basis to the state Medicaid system. But this governor and this legislature never even considered it, never even talked about it. Other states have done it. Why can't we do that in Iowa? Everybody could have had Medicaid, Medicare, or corporate-owned provided insurance. So everybody would have had insurance. Other states have created reinsurance pools on the private side to buy down the cost of the high-risk people in the health insurance arena, which makes it easier for insurance companies to come in and provide individual insurance policies. They have to pay a portion of that high-risk pool, but they don't have to take the risk of being the only one that gets badly selected against. Other states have allowed people who don't have access to private insurance to voluntarily opt into the state employee health insurance plan. But this governor and this legislature didn't consider any of those. I don't know why not, but we should be looking at all those things, because people deserve access to health insurance.
Is there one of those ideas that you think is more feasible than the others, just given the status of where federal funding is for the state on these healthcare programs?
Well, I probably would have looked at the latter two first. I would have supported. I supported the McCoy-Forbes initiative, but that does take some approval by the Medicaid authorities in the federal government. So while we were waiting for that, we could have created that reinsurance pool, or we could have allowed the employees, the individuals who don't have health insurance, to opt into the state employee plan. I mean, if you're a state legislator, you're in that plan. If you're a state employee, you're in that plan. Why can't people who don't have access to any health insurance opt into that plan? They could do it on a means-tested basis. So we could have gotten people covered pretty quickly while we're waiting to see if the other program would have been approved by the federal government.
What about the idea of Medicare for all? Is that something that you would support either as a federally supported program or something that the state could possibly do on its own?
Well, my focus is on the state of Iowa. I want to be the governor for Iowa. And Medicare is a federal program. We all know that. I'm a participant in Medicare. It's a great program. It works very well. But it's a federal program. And I want to make sure we're taking care of Iowans. I think Medicare for all is an issue that's got to be addressed at the federal level. California has tried to do it. Vermont has tried to do it at state level. Neither one could do it. So I don't think there's a likelihood that Iowa could do that economically. If the federal government wants to do that, I think that could be a very good idea. But in the meantime, let's make sure that all Iowans have access to quality, affordable health care and health insurance along the ways we just discussed.
We talked a little bit about mental health care, but I just wanted to ask specifically, so the legislature did take some action. There were some next steps or studies included in the legislation. One of them was to find sustainable funding. The governor also signed an executive order to take the first steps towards setting up a structure for children's mental health care. I'm wondering what you think the priorities are for the next steps for mental health care.
Well, let's talk about the youth mental health program. I was on the phone the other day with a woman who's been very involved in youth mental health, and because she has a child who has mental health issues, and she's been a participant in several different studies that have gone on in our state for the last several years, coming up with ideas about how to put together a youth mental health program in Iowa. The results, the ideas are already out there. What this governor just did is she created another study, and there's no timeline for that study. So it's all words and no commitment. The answers are out there. We just need to accept them and stop doing studies and start to implement things. It's clear we need more long-term acute care beds in our state. We need more community-based support services. We need more psychiatrists and psychologists and counselors with master's degrees. We need more jail diversion programs. We need more crisis intervention training for police departments all across the state. We need more mobile crisis units. All these things, we all know what we need. We don't need to study them. You can look at many other states that are doing a much better job than we are at pieces of that. The facts, the proof is out there. We just need to start doing it. We need to have somebody who steps up and says, this is not acceptable that have such a huge crisis with mental health and substance abuse in our state, and we're going to go to work and we're going to fix it. We're going to stop talking about it and we're going to work on it.
You mentioned property tax levies as a way to pay for some of these services, but property taxes are the least popular type of tax in the state, and there's also a significant lobby in the state against increasing property taxes. Is property tax the best way to continue to pay for mental health, and is there an alternative?
It's not the best way to continue, but I think it's worth consideration that we allow counties to make that decision on their own, because I don't think the state, 150 people sitting in the Capitol know what's best for every county around Iowa. Let's give them the opportunity to raise the tax if they decide locally that it's important enough to do that. Or if they have other sources of funding and they don't need to do that, that's fine too. I want to give more local control back to our communities to make the decisions that impact the lives on the ground in their communities. But long term, if you look at what people have done in Iowa City, in Cedar Rapids, and in Polk County, just 3 examples, where they have tracked when they have jail diversion programs, crisis intervention training, and good quality community-based mental health substance abuse services, they can track how many people are impacting less recidivism in the jail, how many fewer people are going into the emergency rooms with those issues, so they can actually put a dollar amount on how much they're saving by making those investments and having those services in place. And they can prove, and I've seen the numbers, that it is cost effective. Net, it saves money. So my point is, it's to your point about continuing to fund these things. If we're willing to work collaboratively and creatively to put the investments in up front, the proof is there that it can pay for itself over time. Judge Cady, Chief Justice of our Supreme Court, said in his State of the Judiciary that, the drug court, I can't remember the drug court or mental health court, they have them both down in Davenport, is saving $300,000 a year. And yet he can't get any money. And it was mostly run, by the way, by volunteers today because they don't have enough money to fully fund it. They have a mental health court in Sioux City, which is strictly run by volunteers. They save money, but the legislature and the governor aren't willing to give them some more money to the judiciary to expand those things. If it's saving $300,000 a year, why wouldn't we do it? We need all the money we can get to invest in things like that, to then save other money to do other things in our state.
Fred, so how would you work with this current legislature as governor? How would you change their minds on some of these issues?
Well, I wouldn't have to because there'll be a new legislature next year.
Okay. And if there isn't?
Well, who's ever in the legislature, I have my ideas as to, who I'd like to see there, but the governor's going to have to work with who's ever there. And I've worked, like at the Power Fund, when I was the chair of that board, we had elected officials that were Republicans and Democrats. We had department heads that were Republicans and Democrats. We had citizens around the state that were both. Almost every decision we made, and we considered between the due diligence committee and the board over 400 different decisions, almost all of them were unanimous. So, I know how to get to work with people and try to find common ground to get results. So the first thing I would do if I get elected is I'm going to get together with the leaders of both parties and myself and sit down before I craft a budget or craft my plan for the next year. What can we work on together to make some progress for Iowans? What do you want, Republicans? What do you think we need to do next in our state to make this a better place to live and go to work and to grow our economy? And how can I help you be successful in your communities and in your jobs? And say the same to the Democrats and try to find that common ground, because it's so easy to go very quickly to what divides people rather than what unites people. I want to try to find a common ground. Let me give you an example. When I was chairman of Yonkers in the 80s, I was also on Planned Parenthood's board. I got a call from a Catholic nun, a woman in town who's a CEO of Mercy Hospital. Her name was Sister Patricia Claire Sullivan, and she was running Mercy Hospital. And she wanted to meet me, and I hadn't met her before. I said, fine, let's get together. So we did, and we talked for about a half an hour or so, and about health care, and we both realized the importance of health care. And then she said, Fred, I'd like you to go on my board at Mercy Hospital, the Catholic board in town. And I said, well, okay, you know, I've got thousands of employees, thousands of customers. Health care is really important. I'll do that. But I'm also on Planned Parenthood's board, and I'm not going to go off the board of Planned Parenthood to go on your board. And you know what she said? She said, we agree on a lot more than we disagree on. Let's focus on what we agree on. I want you to come get on my hospital board, and we're not going to talk about abortion. I'm not going to change my view. This is her talking, and you're not going to change yours. That's fine. Let's focus on making sure we have the best health care possible in our community. And that's the approach I want to take with the legislature. You know, there's plenty we can disagree on. Well, let's focus on where we can make progress. I don't care who gets the credit. I just want to get results for citizens.
So that, sorry, just one
Go ahead.
follow-up?
Go ahead.
Real quick. That just leads me to another question that I've had. You know, when Kim Reynolds signed the fetal heartbeat bill last week, she said, I'm pro-life, and I've made that very clear. What is the space for personal values in that role of governor? Should you ignore your personal values? To what extent should you be willing to compromise them for the greater good and rights of women? How do you balance? What would be your balancing act?
Well, I think if you're elected governor, you're governor for all Iowans. You're not governor for yourself. You're not governor for this group or that group or this outside interest or this special group or your party. You're governor for all Iowans, and your job is to do the best job you can for all Iowans. So absolutely, I would have never allowed a bill like that to even get to my desk because it's damaging to women's health care. It's damaging to the opportunity of women to participate in our economy and our society on a full basis. And it sends the exact wrong message to everybody outside Iowa, where we're trying to recruit businesses and people to move to Iowa and go to work. And now we're sending the message that we're an extreme state, and that's in newspapers and magazines and stories all over this country. That's the wrong message. If we want to grow our state and we want to help all Iowans, then we don't want to allow that kind of decision making and that kind of leadership in our state.
How do you stop a bill like that from even getting to your desk? Just threatening to veto it all along? Is that what you mean, or? As a governor, you need to be very involved in what's going on in the legislature, and you need to make clear whether you do it publicly or privately. That you can argue back and forth about that in different situations, but that legislature should have known that this is the wrong message for our state. It's going to hurt our ability to attract OBGYNs to our state. It's going to hurt our ability to attract doctors to go to work in our state, or even when they get educated, to stay in our state. And we have a shortage of doctors as it is. And it's going to hurt our ability to attract business to our state. And if we want to help your town and your town and your town that you're elected to represent, then we can't allow this kind of legislation to go forward. And we don't even want it to get passed by the legislature, because even if the governor vetoes it, it's still sending a bad message. Most of the labor unions are supporting one of your opponents. If you are the nominee, how do you inspire them to actually get out and work for your campaign in the general election? Yeah,
I've actually met with a lot of labor union members and the labor union groups around our state. I worked as a member of a labor union twice growing up. I have one of our daughters and her husband, both are members of labor unions today. So I fully respect and support the value and importance of what labor unions bring to our economy and to our state. And that's one of the reasons I'm running for governor, is because taking away collective bargaining rights from state workers and school teachers and what we did on workers' compensation was not necessary, and it's going to be harmful to our state, as we talked about for education before. So I want to restore all those things. And by the way, all of the other Democratic candidates have the same view. We all want to restore collective bargaining rights. We all want to restore the workers' compensation rights, and we all want to restore the right of unions to make it easier to form unions if the employees actually want to do that. And I think I think the union folks that I've talked to, they understand that and they know that. And I want to be the governor for everybody, working families and management. We need to work together to build our state. And I've worked with unions at Yonkers. We always had a good relationship. I've worked with them in other places in the private sector. I've worked with them in state government with union members. And to me, it doesn't matter whether you belong to a union or you don't. Let's work together and advance the interests of the organization.
And we're coming to the end of our time. Does somebody want to get in a question here?
The Democratic Party has said that they really need to reach out to rural voters this year. Are you the guy who can bring them to the table in November?
You know, I used to run the Yonkers department stores, as you know, and we had 19 stores in Iowa, most of them spread across the state. And when I was chair of the Iowa Power Fund, we looked at 400 different investments, mostly agriculture related, wind, solar, biomass related, energy efficiency related, all across the state. So I've spent a lot of my time working all around Iowa. I used to be on the board of Pioneer Hybrid, a big agricultural company, obviously, with businesses all around Iowa. So I fully understand and appreciate the value of what rural Iowa brings to the quality of our state. And so I've spent a lot of my time in this campaign going out and showing up in every single county and sitting down and listening to people and learning from people and finding out what's important to them, what's important to their communities, to their businesses, for their schools, and sharing some of my ideas. And I'm going to continue to do the same thing because I think the governor needs to go out and meet people where they are. You know, the first thing I did when I was a state government and in the Department of Economic Development, 120 plus employees, I went around to every person's office or desk and met with them there. I didn't ask them to come into my office. I went to where they worked. That's what I'm doing in the state, in my campaign. That's what I'll continue to do. You got to go meet people where they are. You got to listen to them and learn from them because there's a lot to learn. And a lot to hear. It's also an opportunity to share ideas and learn how we can work together. And I think people will appreciate in rural Iowa that from my private sector and public sector experience, you know, I'm going to get results. I'm not in this just for some other kind of recognition. I want to get results for Iowans, and that includes all Iowans. And I want to do it based upon what I'm hearing people want and what they think we can do better in this state.
In answering that question, you mentioned your Yonkers experience. Do you have thoughts about all the stores closing in Iowa and how that will impact the state?
Well, it's certainly going to have a negative impact on our state in terms of just the jobs there, absolutely. And it's very unfortunate. You know, that was a business that in 1993, it was successful enough to be a standalone public company and was doing very well. Since then, it's gone through 3 or 4 different owners. And they've been consolidated in with other big department store groups just like Yonkers. A private equity firm bought them and put a bunch of debt on the business. Well, that doesn't work all the time. And you know, that's too bad. That's an example of where, you know, bad management and a good business came together and ruined a business. At the end of the day, their customers, you know, the state will suffer from a lack of jobs and good quality jobs. But I think that a lot of those locations where we have had Yonkers stores in our state, many of them will end up getting filled by other kind of uses. So there will still be a variety of different places for people to shop and entertain and eat and go to the malls where they're located.
Should you win as governor, would you make filling those stores a top priority? Would you try to recruit businesses, a chain to fill all those spots?
So what I would do is if a local community wanted to do that and they had a plan to do that, and they were willing to put some money into it, just like I said before, and they had good leadership, a local idea, local support, yes, the state should be their partner. That should be part of that, what I call the new Vision Iowa type program.
Do you have a priority that we haven't asked you about that you want to mention? And then the final question is, why should the Des Moines Register endorse you?
Well, let me think about the priority here for a second. When we talked about education, that's my #1 priority. And my #2 priority is health care. We've not really talked about Planned Parenthood much. I mean, I told you I was on the board in the 1980s, and my wife and I have continued to be extremely supportive of Planned Parenthood. We helped them open a clinic in Dubuque when they couldn't get access to a property up there. And I think it's very, again, wrong direction, wrong idea, and unfortunate for our state when last year the legislature and the governor defunded Planned Parenthood. It just took healthcare choices away from 15,000 Iowans, not just women, but also men all across our state. And now they've done the same issue with this fetal heartbeat bill, but even more extreme. And now you see the sexual assault issues that are going on in our state, in the state capitol, but also it happens in our private lives. So let's talk about that confluence there. We need to have a governor who is not going to tolerate any kind of that sort of behavior. Women deserve full respect and dignity and the opportunity to be full participants in our society and in our economy. And whether it's this sexual assault activity, or whether it's defunding Planned Parenthood, or this the fetal heartbeat bill, or the privatization of Medicaid, that's hurting women all across our state. If you hurt women, then you're hurting the success of our economy. And you know, if I were governor, first of all, I would have held every single elected official in our state to the very highest standard of integrity and transparency when it relates to sexual assault or harassment in the workplace. Because if you're an elected official, you're a role model for everybody else, and you have to act that way and be held accountable for that. And if you are responsible for that kind of behavior, you need to be individually accountable. The taxpayer should have never had to pay those fines. And if there's any fines coming out of the IFA situation, the taxpayer should not pay those. The people that created the problem should be the people accountable for paying the fines, and in fact, many of the legal costs. So that's a priority of mine, to make sure that everybody gets treated with respect and dignity that they deserve. And when people violate that, they're held individually accountable.
One of the threads that kind of runs through the sexual harassment issues, and if you look at over at Iowa Finance Authority, some of the management issues was fear of retaliation if people speak up. So would you convert some of those at-will jobs back to merit that moved from merit to at-will during the Branstad administration, or would you do something else to make it possible for people to speak up without having to worry about losing their job?
Well, the first thing we should have in state government, like most businesses have today, if they're of any size and significance, is a whistleblower process. It's in place. And I'm not aware that that exists in state government. You know, wherever you work in state government, there ought to be a clear process. If you find something that you don't think is correct, whether it's affecting you directly or it's somebody else who's doing something wrong in their business that's affecting the success of state government, then there should be an 800 number that you can call on an anonymous basis and file that complaint. And there should be a requirement that gets reviewed at least quarterly by some independent group in state government to make sure when there is a claim that's followed up and investigated very quickly, and it's not allowed to linger, like this IFA situation may have been in existence for a year or two. I mean, that should never happen. If we had a good whistleblower system in Iowa, that would have been flushed out a long time ago, and the behavior would have been addressed and taken care of. I've worked in situations where that exists, and there's no reason we can't or shouldn't have that in state government.
Okay. And I don't know if you explicitly said why we should endorse you, but I'll just give you one more shot at that, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, thank you. You know, I think the reason that I would like to have your endorsement is that, first of all, I think I have supported and encouraged and worked hard for the quality of life and the progressive values that make our state a great place for many years. And I'm very committed to those values, and that's going to drive my value judgments. But at the same time, I've demonstrated in the private sector and the public sector that I'm willing to roll up my sleeves and go to work and fix businesses or grow businesses or fix film tax credit scandals. You know, when we had the floods in eastern Iowa, Culver called me in his office, a couple other people, and said, look, we need cash now in eastern Iowa. So a couple of us raised $8 million in about a month and a half, took it to eastern Iowa, and distributed it to people who needed help quickly, because the state and federal money takes a long time. You know, when we had the farm crisis at Yonkers, we created farm aid scholarships to help kids go to school. We brought in farm aid concerts to raise money for struggling farm families. You know, I've demonstrated that I have the values of helping people be successful. I've demonstrated that I know how to get results in the public and private sector. And I've demonstrated I know how to lead. And I have the experience of doing it. And I think that's what we need in our state.
All right. Thank you to Fred Hubbell. All of the other Democratic candidates for governor either have met or will be meeting with the Register in the next couple of weeks. You can see the schedule on DesMoinesRegister.com, and please tune in to DesMoinesRegister.com for all of our coverage of the primary and the general election.